let's continue on with Unit 4, and let's talk about infectious disease. Now, infectious diseases are one of the most common forms of disease that can occur in humans, and an infectious disease comes from the presence of a pathogen. Now, a pathogen is any microorganism that can result in disease, and we call this an infection. So an infection can be something that's local. So, for example, a sore throat, so that's localized to your throat, or an infection in your ear, which is localized to your ear, or it can be systemic, which means it goes throughout a system, and those can be quite severe, and it can be much more difficult to treat. But in order for these infectious diseases to travel from one person to another, they need to have a mode of transmission. And there's several different modes of transmission. We can have direct and indirect transmission of pathogens. Now, like I said, there's dozens of different ways that a microorganism can be transmitted. Microbes like bacteria or viruses or parasites like protists and some worms, for example, animals, they can enter the body directly in the case of an open wound. So if you were to get a bacteria or in some cases a virus, not so much a virus, but certainly a bacteria or a parasite, a protist, into an open cut on your hand, there's a good chance that organism could cause an infection because it's gained access to your body. Microorganisms can also be transmitted indirectly, such as the case of touching a contaminated bench and then touching your mouth. Door handles, elevator buttons, handrails on stairs, escalators. These are all places where we can indirectly pick up a microorganism. They can be living on the object happily for days in some cases. And then we touch it with our hands, and then we go and we rub our eyes, or we touch our mouth or our nose, and then that organism gets transferred from the object to our body, and that can cause infection. Some microorganisms are found in droplets, and a droplet is when somebody speaks or when somebody sneezes, and small tiny droplets of fluid comes out of their mouth or their nose. You can have viruses and bacteria that live on those droplets, and if you're an unlucky person who walks through where somebody sneezed and you inhale those droplets, then those microorganisms can gain access into your respiratory system or your digestive system. Some organisms are completely airborne. That means they can just live on dust particles that are suspended in the air, and if you walk through that air and you breathe in those dust particles, then you may become infected with that pathogen. Some microbes are transmitted sexually. Some of these microbes over time have evolved ways to effectively get through mucous membranes, and the mucous membranes are the ones that line the tubes and ducts that open up from the inside to the outside of the world. So the areas that can cover our genitals and our digestive system, well, these can be transmitted quite easily through sexually. Some microbes require a vector. Now, a vector is a name that we give to a living thing that carries a disease, and probably the most dangerous and important vector in the world is the mosquito. And the mosquito is a vector that carries the protist that causes malaria, and that's just one example. But you can also have a vector being a tick. Many insects represent vectors. Same thing with rodents, mice, and rats can do the same thing. And there's a lot of microorganisms that are genetically designed to spread. Viruses, for example, are genetically designed to spread from person to person, or animal to animal, or plant to plant, even bacteria to bacteria. Now, in order for these pathogens to cause disease, they have to gain access to your body. It means they have to get inside some system in your body. And the portals of entry that we call, these are the ways that these things can get inside you, include the skin. So a broken skin, cut on your skin, a cut or a bruise or a tear or a burn. These are all ways that bacteria can gain entry. Your respiratory tract, when you breathe in, that can invite organisms to get into your respiratory tract. The digestive system, you could eat stuff that's that's contaminated with pathogens or parasites, and finally through the urinary and the reproductive systems. Right? It's another way for a pathogen to gain access to the inside of your body. Now, I don't want you to think that all microorganisms are harmful and the only thing that they do is cause disease, because that's not true. There are a lot of microorganisms that are super important to our well-being and to our health. So there's a couple of species here, just for example, Bifidobacterium. This is a bacteria that we call a probiotic. So a probiotic is something that helps our health, a living thing that helps our health. So this can aid in the digestion, and it can outcompete harmful bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract. So if these guys are present in your intestinal tract and all of a sudden you ingest a pathogen, well, these guys are better suited and they'll probably outcompete. So there's a lower chance that that pathogen can cause disease. And you can find Bifidobacterium in a lot of yogurts. Sometimes I think you can find it in milk as well. But there's in dairy products like that, there's often a lot of probiotics. These are bacteria that are good for us, that help us digest, and they don't cause us harm. And then we can look at yeast, which is a fungus. And yeast is, of course, used to make bread. It's been used for centuries, maybe even thousands of years definitely, to help us make bread. It's also been used extensively to make alcohol. So it's very important species economically. And then we can have, the more deadly ones like the Mycobacterium tuberculosis. This is the bacteria that causes the respiratory infection tuberculosis, and it's very deadly, and it's also very contagious. So we have good and bad microorganisms. So some of the ones here that can cause microorganisms that can cause disease. So again, those are the ones that we call pathogen. And this is a group here, not exclusively, but certainly a list of them. And a prion is the first one we got here. A prion is actually a protein. You'll often hear them called rogue proteins. And this is the infectious agent that causes mad cow disease. You probably heard it called, but in scientific it's usually called BSE, or bovine spongiform encephalopathy. In humans it's called Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease, and it does the same thing. So it infects the central nervous system, and it causes the organism to act erratically, have seizures, just not be normal. The thing about a prion is it's a protein, so it gets incorporated into the body of another organism. And if you eat that infected organism, then that prion can be passed on to the next person or the next animal. These are long-lived diseases. It would take years and years for these diseases to develop to a full-blown level. It can take a long time to even test for them. So prions are really, really tricky because they're simply proteins, and they're very difficult to separate from a pathogen. The next smallest one that we would have to deal with is viruses, of course, and you guys are dealing with the virus every day right now. We're talking about COVID-19. But other examples of viruses are, human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, that causes AIDS, hepatitis. All viruses are pathogenic. Now, the first two right here, these are non-living pathogens. So a virus and a prion is simply a protein, so it's not even, it doesn't have any of the living characteristics that we would need to make a living organism. A virus has proteins, it has genetics, it's a step further, but it can't reproduce all by itself. So without the ability to reproduce, we don't consider it a living organism. So these first two pathogens are considered non-living. The rest of them, the bacteria, for example, and you're quite familiar with bacteria, can cause strep throat, streptococcus infection in your throat. It can cause ulcers in the stomach, tuberculosis that we just talked about. It can cause many different forms of pneumonia, which is an infection of the lungs. The rest of these, the bacteria, the fungi, the protozoa, and the parasites, these are all living organisms. Bacteria, of course, are the prokaryotic cells. Fungi, which can cause pneumonia if you're inhaling the spores over a long period of time. If you're in a building, for example, that has a lot of fungi, it can be quite detrimental to your health. You can also have fungi that cause ringworm, which is a skin infection. Protozoa are a very, very important group of organisms in terms of being parasites to humans. So things like malaria, cryptosporidosis, giardiasis, African sleeping sickness. There's a lot of different protists that cause illness in humans. And then finally we get to the parasites. These can be protists or they can be animals, for instance. So, trichinosis is caused by a protist that lives in the skin and meat. And if you eat infected meat, you could get sick yourself. We often find it in game animals, not so much in meat that you would buy in a store, for example. And we can have roundworms, which are animals, and they can cause infection in many different organisms. Now, if we briefly look at the classification of organisms, we look at all of these different classes. We've got the plants, and algae can sometimes be a problem for humans, but usually plants aren't a big deal when it comes to parasites. Fungi, animals, protists, and moneras, those are the bacteria. These all have representatives that can be parasitic to humans or to other animals. Specifically, when we look at the domains, we talk about bacteria, which are what we would consider the normal everyday bacteria that we would encounter. We have another group here called the archaea. Now these are bacteria that have very different types of metabolism. You'll find these in extreme environments like hot springs where the temperature is really high, or the Dead Sea where the salt concentration is too high for anything to live in. So those are old organisms that evolved a long time ago when the Earth was quite different. And then we have the eukarya, and this represents everything that has eukaryotes that have true nucleus and more complicated cells. So that's going to be the protists, the fungi, the plants, and the animals. But in terms of pathogens, plants for us generally aren't a big deal when it comes to pathogens. So when we're talking about microbiology, we generally study five very broad types, okay? And we'll talk about each of these in the next couple of videos. So we talk about the bacteria, which are the prokaryotic cells. We talk about viruses, which are we consider those not living things, and you guys are probably the generation with the most experience ever with viruses that are living right now. We have fungi, which are a separate category, and we'll talk, like I said, we'll talk about those. Then we have the protists, or the protozoa. These are either unicellular or multicellular. They're a really complex group, a strange group, and we'll talk about those. They're very important parasites for humans. And then we have animals, which are the heterotrophic multicellular organisms, and we can have some pretty complicated parasites that are actually animals. So in the next couple of videos, we'll go over these different groups and how they contribute to disease in humans.